But I'll start by just posing the question, why map our benthic habitats in the first place for marine parks? And put simply, we need at least a basic understanding of what we're protecting in the marine parks if we're going to manage them properly, not the least of which is to answer questions like whether we're meeting the comprehensiveness, adequacy and representativeness of what we've got in the parks, which is one of the fundamental principles of the design. We also need good habitat mapping information to help focus our monitoring program and our management strategies. Down the track, we need an understanding of the habitats so we can get some understanding of connectivity, both between species and between habitats, between different habitats. And finally, we need a baseline that can be used down the track to identify long-term change, the sort of big changes that some speakers alluded to this morning. Now, typically, to get ourselves a good benthic map, we would start by having a full cover source of information, and they're collected or derived from sensors that are generally either airborne or on water, so either aerial satellite imagery or swath sonar. You go through a process of digital classification, digitisation or classification, some form of ground truthing, and then you develop your habitat map. Now, this sort of work has been ongoing in our department for a number of years and still is ongoing and will be a big part of the program in the future. But in the short term, or the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk more about a shorter term strategy that we've got in place for filling knowledge gaps. Now, in the marine parks context, there's a range of existing mapping that we can use, and that mapping has been used in the past to help develop the network and the zoning, but it's not always, it doesn't always meet our needs. It's not necessarily comprehensive, often doesn't cover the areas we're interested in, so quite often it can be, a lot of our past mapping has been near shore and shallow, derived from aerial imagery, so we have large unmapped areas in the deeper water, and sometimes the existing mapping has issues of scale and accuracy that don't make it ideal for what we're doing. So we need to have mapping that's more targeted to the program's needs. The problem is we've got some needs in the shorter term, the sort of reporting that Simon and Danny were alluding to, and we need to get a good inventory of the assets we've got, particularly in the sanctuary zones that are unmapped at the moment, and we need a lot of that sooner rather than later. We've also got a small team, so limited resources, a lot of tasks, so it's hard to get that information quickly with full cover mapping. And the solution to that is to have a strategy that allows us to think more cleverly about what we map and how we map it. So first of all, the obvious one is to prioritise sanctuary zones, and secondly, to develop a rapid assessment method that we can cover some of our knowledge gaps quickly and try and get a basic knowledge of those areas that we can then use to guide our management and monitoring decisions in the shorter and medium term. But also that information can help us target more strategically the areas that we are going to put the effort in and go and map with full cover. So I'm going to talk about from here on mainly about this rapid assessment method, and it's nothing new. We're using a georeferenced video. We're overlaying areas that are unmapped with a sample grid. In our case, we're trying to do it at 1 sample per square kilometre. At each area, we drop a video. We do a 50 metre drift transect, and we classify the habitats in the footage on those videos, and that can be put into the GIS environment and used for reporting. So At its simplest, this is an output for an area that we mapped late last year on KI, the Sponge Garden Sanctuary Zone. It's a fairly simple output, and it's been used in some of our our recent reporting for RIAS. Basically, each of the dots is a pie chart where a video was dropped, and it represents the proportion of reef sand and seagrass at each of those locations. Now, this is a fairly simple output, but the important thing to remember is that, under each of those dots we have another level of detail. There's a classification system that underlies that probably has 10 to 20 habitat classifications within it. And more importantly, for each of those locations, we've got video footage that tells us something about the species or the biota that makes up those habitats, including the habitat-forming species, but also fish species and so forth. So the next question was, how good is it, this method, if we're sampling at this very coarse resolution of 1 drop per square kilometre? And obviously we know exactly what's under the video drop because we can see it on the footage. The question was, for us, how well does this sort of output represent the whole area? And the only way that we could really test that was to go to an area where we have full cover mapping and to try and model or simulate the mapping, the inventory mapping process that we've developed, and do that by overlaying sampling grids on existing mapping. So we've taken existing regional scale mapping, we've chosen a number of areas around the state to represent different levels of complexity, different habitat types. We've overlaid each of those with a range of sampling grids at different intensities, and then repeated that process a number of times to get a bit of an idea of how effective that resolution of sampling is at giving us a good picture of what's there. And we assess that based on, first of all, the number of habitats we're picking up at the various resolutions compared to what we know to actually be there, at least in the habitat maps. And secondly, to look at how well we're representing the proportions of those habitats at each of the sampling resolutions. Now, as I said, we're aiming for this resolution of 1 sample per square K, which on first consideration seems very coarse, and you would suspect it not to tell you a lot, but the results we got were actually quite surprising. So this first graph is the percentage of habitats we were detecting in each of the areas at various resolutions, which are across the bottom of the graph. The one that I've circled there is 25 samples, which is 1 per square kilometre, which is what we're aiming for. And what you can see there, this is much like a species area curve. You can see that at that sampling intensity, you're getting up towards the top of the curve. And in the case of, in the case of at that resolution, 2 of the areas, we were getting 75 to 80% of the habitats that we knew to be there. And even in the place that was the most complex, it was very diverse in terms of the number of habitats, but also quite small habitat patch sizes. We were getting 65% there as well. So basically, it would appear that using this technique at this resolution, we're getting a reasonable picture of what's there, and it's worth noting that the habitats that you're picking up on this end of the curve are likely to be the ones that represent the most in terms of aerial coverage. So we can probably safely say we're picking up the significant habitats in the area. The other thing is that if you increase your effort that you're putting into this and quadruple that to 100 points, 4 times the amount of sampling effort, but you're only really picking up a few extra species, and again, they're the ones that are probably spatially not as largely represented. If we look at this representation of the relative proportions of the habitats there, and again this is for one of the areas, Marion Bay. Across the bottom we've got sampling intensities, and this is the separation between sampling points. So at 1 sample per square kilometre, if you eyeball that and compare it to this bar here, which is the actual proportion of the habitats that were there, the modelling would suggest that you're getting a fairly good representation of what's actually there, and by increasing the sampling, you're not really changing that picture a whole lot. That held true for the other 2 areas that we looked at. Again, even with the very diverse area, if you eyeball the resolution we're using, the 1 sample per square K, it looks fairly similar to the actual proportions. So we can probably safely say, based on that we're, with this method and this resolution, we're getting a fairly good picture of what's there in terms of the number of species. We're getting a reasonably good representation of what the proportions of those habitats are spatially, and more importantly, we're getting it at a very low cost in terms of effort. And that's an important point, because obviously if we increase the intensity and start putting a lot of effort into this, we may as well be doing full cover mapping for the areas. So I'll now just show you an area that we recently surveyed as a sort of a case study to illustrate some of the other information we get out of this method. This is the Orcades Bank. It's in between Kangaroo Island and York Peninsula. It was basically one of those areas that are unmapped because it's out in deeper water. That's not to say we didn't know anything about it. It was zoned as a sanctuary zone based on information that there's a feature out there. That feature is important in the spawning of King George whiting. But we didn't know a whole lot more than that. So the guys went out and did some sampling with the videos over a couple of days, and just using this figure that is similar to the one you saw earlier. It's basically pie charts at each of the drop locations showing the proportion of reef and sand habitats. Even at this simple level, this was quite surprising to us because, oops, I'll learn to use this by the end of the talk. The Orcades Bank, which is up there, which is the significant feature that the zone was largely meant for, but probably surprisingly to us, 2/3 of those areas had some sort of reef community as well. So there's quite a bit more reef community out there than what we thought. The second thing to note is, again, as I said earlier, each of these this is a very simple representation of just very basic habitat categories, but underlying each of these is a lot more information, and I'll try and illustrate that further now with some of the videos and pictures of those areas. So, for example, for the Orcades Bank itself, we now know something about what it looks like just from the video. It's a fairly significant chunk of reef, which is probably not new news to most people, but at least now we can see some of the species of invertebrates, algae, and some of the fish species there, so we've got a feel for what that is. But importantly, we've got a much better feel for a lot of those pie diagrams that were just yellow soft sediment. There's a lot of interesting communities on those as well. So these were bryozoans, there's ascidians, mixed invertebrate beds, and as I mentioned, a lot of reef habitat around the whole area, and this was quite interesting because they were a lot of low flat reefs with ledges that had higher abundances of fish and invertebrates than, or appeared to, than the actual bank itself. So I'll finish it up there because Ellie's pushing me along. Not sure if we have time for questions, but you done? I'm done.
Good ending. Thank you, Dave. We've got time for